There's a standard cliche, which I am sure you have all heard, that if you have two economists in one room, you are bound to have at least three opinions. The subject I'm going to talk about today, however, is one subject with respect to which that is not true. With respect to the area of international trade, with respect to the question of whether it is desirable for a country to have free trade or to have tariffs and other restrictions on imports and exports, in that particular area, economists have spoken with almost one voice for some 200 years. Ever since the father of modern economics, Adam Smith, published his great book, The Wealth of Nations, in 1776, the same year in which the Declaration of Independence was issued in this country, ever since then, the economics profession has been almost unanimous on the subject of the desirability of free trade. Of course, complete unanimity is hardly ever possible, and every once in a while there have been some deviations from the straight and narrow path. Almost always, those deviations have reflected not a disagreement with the fundamental message of Adam Smith, not a disagreement that in the good world free trade would be the best of all possible courses, but they have tended to reflect special circumstances of the time. Perhaps the most famous such deviation was by the most noted, and some would say notorious, of the modern economists, John Maynard Keynes, the English economist who gave his name to the Keynesian Revolution. In 1931, in the course of the Depression, John Maynard Keynes, who had been a free trader all his life, came out in some articles in Britain in favor of departing from free trade and of introducing tariffs. He did so not because he thought that was in and of itself the best policy, but because he thought that the best policy was politically unfeasible. In his view, the right policy for Britain at that time was to go off the gold standard, end a fixed exchange rate, allow the pound sterling to be a free market currency whose price would be determined in the market, as it now is, of course, in a world of floating exchange rates today. But Keynes, an economist, made the political judgment that it was not politically feasible for Britain to go off the gold standard. Tariffs are a step, are an alternative to devaluation. After all, it comes roughly to the same thing if on the one hand, the price of the pound sterling was changed from the $4.80 some, which then was the price, to, let's say, $4. That would make British goods cheaper to foreigners. It would make foreign goods more expensive to Britons, and in that way it would redress the problem of the balance of payments they were facing. That's one way to do it, and the best way. But he thought that was politically unfeasible, and it comes to the same thing to introduce a tariff on imports and a subsidy to exports. That's an indirect and concealed form of devaluation. And so Keynes came out for that concealed form. His political judgment was, like that of many economists, flawed, and about 3 weeks after he came out for a tariff on these grounds, Britain went off the gold standard. I may say that this is not an isolated story. Time and again, economists, in my opinion, have erred when they have proposed second-best solutions in the area where they are experts, namely economics, because of predictions they make about political feasibility in an area where they are not experts. Now, as you will, it's often argued that the reason we have bad economic policy is because the experts disagree. That if only the experts would agree, if only all economists were of the same mind, then we would have an excellent and fine economic policy. The case of free trade and the tariff is a clear counterexample. Here is one case where economists have all agreed, or essentially so. As I say, you have the very minor deviations like Keynes, but very few others. And yet, except for the case of Great Britain, from the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846 to the First World War, when for nearly a century Britain had complete free trade with no tariffs whatsoever on anything, except for that case, tariffs have been widespread. Why is it that you have the professional agreement on the one side and observed practice on the other, which departs so sharply from that agreement? The political reason is fairly straightforward. The political reason is that the interests that press for protection are concentrated. The people who are harmed by protection are spread and diffused. Indeed, the very language shows the political pressure. We call a tariff a protective measure. It does protect. It protects the consumer very well against one thing. It protects the consumer against low prices. And yet we call it protection. Each of us tends to produce a single product. We tend to buy 1,001 products. If we impose a tariff on steel or restrict imports of steel in other ways, the people who benefit are visible and clear and available and apparent. They have a very strong interest to press for restraints in that respect. The interest of the rest of us is very diffuse. Each of us will pay a few pennies more. We don't have the same interest to oppose it. If I may take a much more extreme case, which you may think does not come under the heading of protection, but yet does. We have a program of subsidizing the merchant marine, the maritime industry. That is really protection, because what we're doing is taking measures to prevent the use of foreign ships, that is, of importing the services of transporting goods. Those measures to benefit the merchant marine through shipbuilding subsidies, through operating subsidies, and so on, involve a total expenditure each year of roughly $600 million. That amounts to about $15,000 per year for each of the 25,000 people who is affected. You may be sure that they have every incentive to spend a lot of money on lobbying, on giving contributions to political candidates and so on to see that continue. But $600 million, the population of 200 million people, that's $3 apiece for each of us. Which one of us is going to go to Washington and lobby our congressman to avoid that extra $3 of taxes? Let me take another example of exactly the same thing. Why have we had price supports of farm products? To take up a subject of special interest here, and where there are special interests here concerned with that. We are all of a special interest. It's only the other fellow who's a special interest. Why have we had farm price supports? It's exactly the same argument. And the farm price supports are again a measure that you will find it hard, very, very hard to find any economist except a small number of agricultural economists and schools in the farm belt. You will find it very hard to find any economists who will support farm price supports. They are another case in which the consumer is simply being protected against low prices. Why do we have them? Because the agricultural interest has been concentrated and the consumer interest diffused and widespread, because you have a relatively small group of people who regard themselves as having much at stake, and therefore they are able to be more effective politically than the diffused consumer interest. We often think that this is a country in which we have majority rule. That's true. It is a democracy. We do elect people to Congress. We do have majority rule. But it's a very special kind of majority. It's a majority that is formed by a coalition of minorities. If you want to get elected to Congress, the way to do it is to find 3% of the people who will say to you, if you vote for this, we'll vote for you whatever else you do. And then you find another 3% and another 3%, and you build up a 51% majority consisting of a coalition of special interests. And yet, that overstates the case. Because it's also true that special concentrated groups of that kind have never been able to get their way unless they could make a plausible case that it was in the general interest of the country as a whole to promote their special interests. The mercantile interests could not have gotten their way unless they had been able to persuade at least a large fraction of the public that there was a genuine national security reason for maintaining a merchant marine. The agricultural interest, the farm price support proponents, could never have gotten their way unless they had been able to establish a case that appeared plausible to a large fraction of the people that there was a national interest in preserving a family farm or in some other aspect of agriculture. So the question, in some ways, if we go below this superficial level to a deeper level, the question is, why is it that the economists have not been able to persuade the public of the virtues of a free trade policy? After all, the argument for free trade is basically a very, very simple argument. Let me give you the argument which Adam Smith made 200 years ago. It's as persuasive now as it was then. And I quote, "In every country, it always is and must be in the interest of the great body of the people to buy whatever they want of those who sell it cheapest." The proposition is so very manifest that it seems ridiculous to take any pains to prove it. Nor could it ever have been called in question had not the interested sophistry of merchants and manufacturers confounded the common sense of mankind. Their interest is, in this respect, directly opposite to that of the great body of the people. That was the argument as he put it 200 years ago, and there is very little that needs to be added to it.